Hi, my name is Hannah Laveris, and I'm going to be this week's discussion leader for the pivotal event of the I Have a Dream speech. So, to get started, um, first of all, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech on August 28th of 1963 during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was arguably one of the most famous events of the Civil Rights Movement. Before getting into the details about the speech and the context in which it was given, I wanted to give some background information on who gave the speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His father was a pastor and mother a former school teacher, and he was the second of three children in his family. King grew up in an Auburn neighborhood, which was also the home to some of the most influential and prosperous African Americans in the country. King was a gifted student, and at the age of only 15 was admitted to Morehouse College, where he studied medicine and law. This was also the alma mater of his father and grandfather. King originally had no intention in the following of his father's career as a pastor. However, he changed his mind while mentoring under his college's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays. He was an influential and outspoken advocate for racial equality. After graduating from Morehouse College, King got his Bachelor of Divinity degree at the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. A cool fact that he was also elected president of his predominantly white senior class during a time of much segregation. He also earned his doctorate degree at Boston University in systematic theology, and he met his wife Corta Scott in Boston, and they eventually wed in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama. This is where King became a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and he also had 4 children. So, going back during the 1950s and 60s, this time where King and his family were living in Montgomery, the civil rights movement was moving in full swing. The movement was a struggle for social justice for blacks to gain equal rights under the law in the United States. Although the Civil War had officially abolished slavery many years ago, it did not end the discrimination against blacks and African Americans and the efforts of racism on the community. In the South, this problem was especially apparent. By the 1950s, African Americans had had enough of violence, prejudice, and discrimination and began to gather along with other white supporters to fight for equality. The fight spanned for more than 2 decades. So King's first influence on the civil rights movement was him being chosen as the protest leader and official spokesman of the Montgomery bus boycott. During the period in which King lived in Montgomery, the city was highly segregated and became a major city that highlighted the struggle for civil rights for African Americans in America. King's actions in this position were wildly influenced by the idea of civil disobedience. This was the refusal to obey certain laws or governmental demands for the purpose of influencing new legislation or government policy. It is characterized by acts of nonviolent techniques such as the Montgomery bus boycott that took place. The approach of nonviolent resistance came from King's interest in Gandhi. Gandhi practiced the philosophy against racism in South Africa. King believed that Gandhi's philosophy was the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. King encountered these ideas during his study at Crozer, which was where he got his spiritual degree. King's nonviolent campaign during the Montgomery bus boycott was his first application of this, and it played an important role in his influence during the civil rights movement. The ideas of nonviolent defiance also came from the South African president Nelson Mandela. Mandela directed campaigns against the South African government and its racist policies as well. He sacrificed many things, including spending 27 years in jail for political offenses, and Mandela was also seen as a source of inspiration by King for the advocacy of civil rights. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, King was later arrested in 1963 while leading supporters of his Southern Christian Leadership Conference in a nonviolent campaign. While in jail, King wrote his famous letter to a local white ministers criticizing his tactics in the fight for civil rights with the use of civil disobedience as well. His letter was later published in national press, and shocking images of police brutality against the nonviolent protesters helped build much more support for the civil rights cause. Later that same year, in September of 1953, a church was bombed. This was the 16th Street Baptist Church that had long been a significant religious center in Birmingham, Alabama. It was a common meeting place for civil rights organizers such as King. People were inside the church, and 4 young girls were killed during the bombing, and as many as 20 injured. There was no question that this bombing, along with 2 other bombings that had occurred days before, were targeting the African American community. Outrage of these events helped increase support for the continuing struggle to end segregation to help lead the passage of both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Around this time, after these events and King's letter from Birmingham jail, King continued to move forward with another event to help from the founders of the Negro American Labor Council, Philip Randolph. The two planned a job rights march, eventually coming together by the summer of 1963, which was the March on Washington. All of these events have led up to the March on Washington, where King will give his speech. So this event was to consist of a peaceful political rally designed to attract attention to the injustices African Americans were facing across the country. It was also a mile-long march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial to honor Lincoln, the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation to end slavery. The march was to feature prominent speakers and state goals and demands such as desegregated public schools, addressing violations of constitutional rights for African Americans, and expanding federal work programs for African Americans. The March on Washington had a much larger turnout than expected, with an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 people to participate. King's speech began toward the end of the march after performances and other speakers. It's interesting to note that King did not even sit down to write his speech until the day before the march, and he finished the draft by midnight. King's speech was to represent a spiritual call for peace and equality and his hopes for America to change. It was said that King's speech started slowly. However, King was talented in the fact that he could incorporate references to other works such as the Bible and the U.S. Constitution and other themes into his speech. He was clever in that he brought the hypocrisies of themes stated in works such as the U.S. Constitution. He talked about how it was to be black in America and the shameful condition of race relations after the freedom of slaves. It was also stated that America defaulted in when she used the idea of a check where black citizens were not part of the rights that were given to every other man with the Constitution. King maintains a positive and uplifting tone during the speech up until around the halfway point, where Mahalia Jackson interrupts him to tell people about his dream. It is debated whether King actually heard this, but King began to speak directly to the people instead of from his prepared text. It was then his famous "I have a dream" took over the speech, and King's voice was trembling with passion and hope. I enjoyed the ending of King's speech and how he ironically says, "Let freedom ring," and talks about when all of God's children are equal, everyone will be free at last. King's speech quickly became a slogan for the remainder of the civil rights movement. King's "I Have a Dream" speech brought an even greater attention to the civil rights movement and the goals for the movement. However, the universal views of the time directly after King's speech was delivered, did not embark on immediate change. Some political leaders even spoke in opposition of King's speech and the demands of the civil rights activists. Some Democrats even made the argument that African Americans should be happy with what they had and not ask for more. Nonetheless, support still proceeded, and the speech was still significant enough to gain support and eventually help secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended segregation in public places and banned any discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origins. A year later, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law to overcome legal barriers at state and local levels that prevented African Americans from using their rights to vote. Both of these acts are considered to be one of the most successful accomplishments of the civil rights movement and denouncing of this movement. 2 years after the accomplishments of MLK and his presence, he was assassinated on the night of April 4th, 1968. He was shot standing on the balcony of a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. His death provoked a wave of riots across major cities and a lot of rebellion. MLK left a significant legacy after his death to this day. His work has been honored with a national holiday, school and public buildings named after him, and a memorial on the National Mall in Washington. His legacy provided a model for many people in the combat against inequalities still faced today. The stride for equality and push for civil rights still is an issue today. Although we have come a long way from the time during of Martin Luther King's time and the time in which his speech was given, people must continue to call for justice for all. With the election of the first African American president, Barack Obama, it is not a question that MLK and his legacy had influenced that historic win for equality. Many people even draw comparisons to the two African American leaders based on their passion for justice and their symbolic representation of each other. MLK would have felt at peace if he were still alive to see the election of the first African American president, and hopefully this made his hopes of his dreams closer to becoming a reality. So with all that in mind, my questions for you guys are, during the Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream, it was stated that about halfway through the speech he completely shifted his tone and was thought to have improvised most of the I Have a Dream section of the speech. Do you believe this shift was planned, or was it because of Mahalia Jackson's interruption to tell them about the dream? Or do you also think this part of the speech had previously been written or completely improvised? Use research to justify your answers. The second question is, Martin Luther King Jr. is shown to have a lasting influence on the quest for equality and civil rights and had no means of stopping. What do you think King would still be doing today if he had not been assassinated, and how would he feel about where African American equality stands in today's America? You can use recent events, events after his assassination, whatever you'd like. Okay? Thank you.